The unseen storm. Kayla Mitchell sat by the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of clouds. The hum of the airplane was a constant presence in her ears, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the quiet rhythm of her thoughts. It was just another flight, another business trip, and she relished the calm it brought her. She was used to the hustle and bustle of her life, but there was something peaceful about flying that grounded her, even if only for a few hours. It was just her, the soft hum of the plane, and the endless sky outside. She had long ago learned how to embrace the solitude that came with her position. Kayla wasn't the type to revel in attention or public recognition. Despite being the wife of one of the most influential men in the airline industry, she had perfected the art of being inconspicuous. She preferred it that way. No flashing designer bags, no fancy outfits to draw attention. She was just a woman traveling from one city to another, going about her day as anyone else would. This flight was no different, or so she thought. Richard Mitchell, her husband, was the owner of the very airline Kayla was flying on. He was known for his success and power, but he had always kept his personal and professional lives separate. Kayla supported him in everything, but she preferred to remain behind the scenes. She didn't need to be treated differently because of who she was married to. In fact, she didn't want that. She had her own life, her own career, and she made sure to live it quietly and without fanfare. But on this particular flight, she would learn that there were people who couldn't resist judging others based on appearance alone. A flight attendant named Tiffany, who had been working on the flight for the past few hours, walked through the cabin, her eyes scanning the passengers as she made her rounds. She was known for her sharpness, her quick judgment, and her unapproachable demeanor. She had already served the drinks and snacks, and now she was walking down the aisle once again, checking to make sure everyone was settled. Her eyes landed on Kayla, who was sitting quietly by the window. Tiffany's eyes narrowed slightly as she observed her. The woman had no designer clothes, no flashy accessories, and seemed almost too ordinary. She couldn't understand why someone like her would be flying in first class, especially on a flight with so many high-profile passengers. Tiffany was used to seeing the wealthy and famous passengers on these flights, people who stood out for all the right reasons. But this woman, she was different. Plain, unimportant in Tiffany's eyes. She approached Kayla's seat with a smile that felt more forced than friendly, her voice dripping with condescension. "Excuse me, ma'am," Tiffany said, her tone sharp and cold. "Can you please buckle your seatbelt? You should have done that when the seatbelt sign came on." Kayla, who had been lost in her thoughts, looked up at the flight attendant. She was a little surprised by the harshness of Tiffany's voice, but she didn't let it bother her. She simply nodded and reached for her seatbelt, fastening it quietly, trying to avoid causing a scene. Her calm demeanor was a shield she had perfected over the years. She had learned how to deal with people who misunderstood her quiet nature and assumed it was a sign of weakness. It wasn't. But Tiffany wasn't satisfied. "Do you not understand the rules?" she continued, her eyes narrowing. "This is not a free ride. We have to follow protocol." Kayla felt a pang of frustration, but she didn't let it show. She didn't want to cause trouble, but something about Tiffany's judgmental attitude rubbed her the wrong way. She wasn't some inexperienced traveler who didn't know how to follow rules. She was a professional, a woman who had built her own career, her own life. Nothing about her warranted this kind of treatment. Still, she remained silent, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the seatbelt, trying to keep her composure. Tiffany, satisfied that she had made her point, walked away, but not without casting one last, judgmental glance over her shoulder. Kayla could feel the weight of the stare as it lingered, the humiliation creeping in. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been sitting there, minding her own business. But in Tiffany's eyes, she was nothing. Just another faceless passenger who didn't deserve any respect. As the flight continued, Kayla's mind raced. She had dealt with people like Tiffany before. People who thought they were better than others, who judged based on appearances, and made assumptions without ever taking the time to truly understand who someone was. It wasn't just about being disrespected. It was about being dismissed. And that feeling, that sense of invisibility, cut deeper than she cared to admit. The tension in her chest grew as she replayed the interaction over and over in her mind. She wasn't the type to make a scene, but something about this moment felt different. Tiffany's words, her attitude, it wasn't just rude. It felt like a judgment of everything Kayla was. The quiet woman sitting by the window, who had never sought attention, who was just trying to get through the day. It was as if Tiffany assumed that because Kayla was dressed simply, she had no value, no importance. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Kayla couldn't shake the feeling of being undermined, of having been treated as if she were insignificant. The other passengers watched the exchange with mixed expressions. Some looked uncomfortable, some pretended not to notice. But no one stepped in. No one said a word. Kayla's experience of being treated like less than she was had gone unnoticed by the very people who might have stood up for her. But it wasn't about them. It was about her. As the flight continued its journey, Kayla pulled out her phone, her fingers moving over the screen as she typed a message to her husband, Richard. She didn't normally bother him during his work hours, especially when he was in meetings, but this felt different. She needed to talk to him. She needed him to know what had happened. Her frustration bubbled up as she typed, trying to convey the seriousness of the situation without letting her emotions take over. Richard, I'm sorry to bother you, but I just had an awful encounter with one of the flight attendants. She was rude and disrespectful, and I don't think I can just let this go. It was a simple message, but for Richard, it would be the spark that ignited a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. Kayla didn't know yet, but her husband was a man of action. When he read those words, he would spring into motion, and the consequences of Tiffany's actions would come crashing down in ways she never could have imagined. Meanwhile, Tiffany continued with her duties, oblivious to the storm she had unwittingly set in motion. She still thought nothing of the encounter, assuming that Kayla was just another nameless passenger. She had no idea who she had just humiliated, and she would soon learn that this mistake would be one she would never forget. As Kayla sat back in her seat, her phone buzzing with a response from Richard, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She didn't want to make a fuss, but she knew that sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't about raising your voice. It was about making sure people understood the power of respect. This flight had become more than just a simple trip. It had become a turning point. And in the moments to come, Kayla would learn that even the smallest actions could have the biggest consequences. The ripple effect. Kayla sat quietly, staring at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. She reread her message to Richard, unsure of whether she had expressed herself clearly enough. She had wanted to convey the weight of her experience, how Tiffany's behavior had affected her. But as she reread the words, they didn't seem to do the injustice justice. The humiliation, the condescension, the way she had been so carelessly dismissed, it was all still fresh, still burning inside her. It wasn't just about the rudeness. It was about the way people like Tiffany assumed they could treat others based on their own prejudices. She looked out of the window again, trying to steady her thoughts. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to escalate the situation further. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let it go. She had seen too many instances in her life where people like Tiffany took advantage of their positions to belittle those they deemed lesser. And she had had enough. The plane's descent started, the slow decline towards their destination pulling her back to reality. Kayla couldn't help but wonder what Richard would do. She knew he had always been protective of her, perhaps too much at times. But this felt different. She wasn't just a wife venting about her rude experience. She was a woman standing up for what was right. She had never asked for special treatment, but she demanded respect. Everyone did. Everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter who they were or where they came from. As the plane continued its descent, her phone buzzed again, startling her from her thoughts. Richard's response was waiting. "Don't worry, Kayla. I'll take care of it. This won't go unnoticed. I'll make sure Tiffany understands the weight of what she did. It's not just about this flight. It's about setting a standard for everyone who works for us. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and I'll handle it. Just sit tight." Kayla stared at the message for a long moment, her heart swelling with a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She knew Richard would handle it, of course. He was always a man of action, decisive and quick to make things right. But even with his promise, she wasn't sure what the fallout would be. She had no interest in seeing someone lose their job over a moment of poor judgment, but she knew something had to change. There were too many people like Tiffany who thought they could dismiss others based on superficial assumptions, and it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt small, ignored, or devalued. The flight attendants began to prepare for landing, walking down the aisle, and Kayla noticed Tiffany at the front of the cabin, collecting the last few items from the passengers. Kayla could feel her eyes narrowing in her direction, a faint flicker of recognition in Tiffany's gaze. It was as if the air in the cabin had thickened, and for the first time, Kayla felt a new kind of tension hanging between them. It wasn't just the unease of an uncomfortable interaction. It was something more, something that neither of them could put into words yet. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels grinding against the tarmac as it came to a halt. Passengers began to gather their belongings, the familiar rush of people standing up and stretching filling the cabin. Kayla remained seated for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind inside her. She didn't know what was coming next, but she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure the right lesson was learned. As the passengers filed out of the plane, Kayla watched them pass by, her eyes scanning the faces of the people around her. She wasn't interested in them. Not now. Her focus was on the woman who had wronged her, the one who had judged her without knowing a single thing about her. Tiffany had returned to her normal, cold demeanor, offering polite goodbyes to the passengers as they exited. But Kayla could feel the shift in the air. It was like the calm before a storm. She stood up slowly, the heels of her shoes clicking against the floor as she made her way to the front of the cabin. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. There was no need for theatrics, no need to raise her voice. This wasn't about proving a point for herself. It was about something bigger. It was about showing Tiffany and everyone else that respect wasn't something that could be dismissed or ignored. Tiffany, who had been busy offering her polite smile to the departing passengers, caught sight of Kayla moving toward her. At first, she didn't recognize the woman walking with such quiet authority. There was no hint of anger in her step, no sign of confrontation, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made Tiffany stop and take notice. It wasn't like the other passengers, those who came and went without so much as a glance. This woman had presence. Kayla reached the front of the cabin and paused for a moment, her gaze fixed on Tiffany. The younger flight attendant looked at her, her lips curving into a small, polite smile, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now. She couldn't quite place why, but she knew something had changed. The easy confidence she had felt earlier, the dismissive attitude, was gone. In its place was a quiet, unsettling tension. Kayla took a deep breath and spoke calmly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had felt over the past few hours. "I'm not here to argue," she said, her tone measured and direct. "I just wanted to let you know that I wasn't happy with how I was treated today. The disrespect wasn't just from you. It was from everyone who assumed I didn't belong." Tiffany's expression faltered for a moment, the polite smile slipping as she tried to process Kayla's words. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the confrontation. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Kayla wasn't interested in hearing an apology. Not yet. Kayla's voice remained steady. "It's not about your apology. It's about how you treat people. I don't need anyone to bow down to me, but I also don't need to be treated like I'm invisible. I'm the wife of the airline's owner, and I expect better. This attitude, this judgment, it doesn't fly with me." Tiffany's heart dropped into her stomach. She blinked rapidly, the words slowly sinking in. For the first time in the conversation, she felt the weight of her own actions. The woman she had dismissed so easily, the one she had judged as just another passenger, was far more important than she could have ever imagined. She was the one person she should have been treating with respect, not with condescension. Tiffany stammered, her mind struggling to come up with a response. She wasn't sure how to apologize, how to make this moment right. She had underestimated Kayla, made assumptions based on nothing but her appearance, and now she was paying the price. But before she could even think of something to say, Kayla turned and walked away, leaving Tiffany standing in stunned silence. The realization of her mistake hit her like a ton of bricks, and she could only watch as the woman she had wronged disappeared into the crowd of departing passengers. The ripple effect had begun, but neither of them knew just how far it would go. The unraveling. Tiffany stood frozen for a moment, her mind reeling from the conversation that had just unfolded. Her usual confidence had crumbled, replaced by a sense of vulnerability she wasn't accustomed to. She watched as Kayla walked away, her footsteps purposeful, her head held high. It wasn't just the words that struck Tiffany. It was the quiet strength that emanated from Kayla. The woman didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. She carried it effortlessly. That, more than anything, was what made Tiffany's heart sink. As the cabin doors finally opened, Tiffany stood still for a moment longer, her hands trembling slightly as she folded her uniform. She had done her best to keep her composure, but now that the moment was over, she couldn't shake the realization that she had just made a huge mistake. She had treated someone poorly, someone who, in retrospect, she should have treated with the utmost respect. The flight had landed, and Tiffany was quickly thrust back into the usual routine of unloading passengers and making sure the cabin was cleared. But her mind kept returning to that brief exchange with Kayla, replaying it over and over. She had felt her world tilt when Kayla had revealed who she was, the wife of the airline's owner. Tiffany couldn't believe it. The woman she had mocked, dismissed, and assumed to be of no importance was the very person she should have been most respectful toward. She had been too quick to judge, too arrogant to realize who she was dealing with. As Tiffany worked, she tried to push the thoughts of Kayla out of her mind, but it was impossible. She could feel the guilt creeping up on her, the nagging sense that she had made an irreparable mistake. Worse, she knew that Kayla's message to Richard, her husband, was already on its way to setting things in motion, things that Tiffany couldn't undo. Meanwhile, Kayla had already disembarked from the plane, walking through the jetway with the weight of the conversation heavy on her mind. As she moved through the terminal, her phone buzzed again. Richard had replied almost immediately, as he always did when something concerned her. Kayla unlocked her phone, scanning the words with a growing sense of unease. "I've made sure the situation is being handled, Kayla. Don't worry. This is bigger than just this flight, and we'll make sure everyone at the company knows what happened. I'll personally speak to Tiffany. She won't get away with this." Kayla read the message again, feeling a mixture of relief and discomfort. She hadn't wanted Richard to overreact. She hadn't asked for anyone's head on a platter. She only wanted to make sure that no one else would have to go through the same kind of treatment. But now that Richard was involved, she knew there was no turning back. This was no longer just a simple disagreement with a flight attendant. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that respect and kindness were non-negotiable, no matter who you were. Still, part of her felt guilty. Tiffany didn't deserve to lose her job over this. She was only human after all. But Kayla knew that Tiffany's actions weren't isolated. People like her existed everywhere, in all walks of life. People who felt entitled to dismiss others based on their own assumptions. Tiffany needed to learn that her behavior had consequences. It wasn't about power or privilege. It was about treating others with dignity, no matter their background or status. As Kayla made her way to the airport lounge to wait for her connecting flight, she received another message from Richard. This one was more personal, and it made her heart soften. "I know you don't like making a big deal out of things, but this goes beyond you and me. This is about setting a standard for everyone who works with us. I'll handle everything, and you won't have to worry. I promise we're going to make sure no one ever feels that way again." Kayla couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth spread through her chest. Richard had always been a man of integrity, and though he was powerful and influential, he never let that cloud his sense of fairness. He respected her wishes to stay out of the spotlight, but he also knew when to step in and make things right. She appreciated that about him. She just hoped that, in the end, Tiffany would understand the lesson, even if it came at a cost. Meanwhile, Tiffany was still trying to shake off the weight of the encounter. As soon as she finished her duties for the day, she went back to the crew break room, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was angry with herself, embarrassed, and most of all, scared. Scared of the repercussions that were inevitably coming her way. She had made an enemy out of someone who was far more important than she had realized. And now she feared that her job, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was at risk. Tiffany tried to push the fear aside, but it gnawed at her. She knew the stakes. Richard Mitchell was no small player in the airline industry. If he was involved, if he had seen Kayla's complaint, then things were about to get serious. She wasn't naive enough to think she could just apologize and make everything go away. She had made a mistake, and the consequences were now unfolding before her. As Tiffany sat in the break room, scrolling through her phone in an attempt to distract herself, she received a message from her supervisor. The text was short but direct. "Please report to my office. We need to discuss an issue regarding a complaint filed against you on Flight 927. Tiffany's stomach dropped. She felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew exactly what it was about. It was the moment she had feared. She had been called in to account for her behavior toward Kayla, and there was no escaping it now. The damage had been done, and Tiffany could only brace herself for what was to come. Back in the lounge, Kayla was preparing to board her connecting flight when she received yet another message from Richard. This time, it wasn't just an update. It was a confirmation of what she had feared and hoped for. The message was brief but impactful. "I've handled it. Tiffany has been suspended pending further investigation. I'm making sure that this is addressed at every level, and I'll be personally overseeing the training moving forward. This can't happen again, Kayla." Kayla read the message, her heart heavy. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted anyone to lose their job. She only wanted Tiffany to understand the impact of her actions. But now, the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. She knew Richard was just doing what he thought was right, but this wasn't the outcome she had envisioned. She sat back in her seat, the finality of the situation sinking in. There would be no going back. Tiffany's fate was sealed, and it was too late to change anything now. Kayla's eyes welled with unshed tears, not for herself, but for Tiffany, who would now have to live with the consequences of her own judgment. As she boarded the next flight, Kayla thought about how quickly things had escalated. What had started as a small, uncomfortable moment had turned into something far bigger than she could have anticipated. But she also knew, deep down, that this wasn't about one person's mistake. It was about a much larger issue. It was about creating a world where respect was automatic, where no one had to fight for the dignity they deserved. Kayla hoped that, in time, people like Tiffany would learn that respect wasn't a gift to be earned. It was a right that everyone, regardless of their status or appearance, deserved. And that was the lesson Kayla hoped would resonate long after the dust had settled. The consequences unfold. The next few days passed in a blur for Tiffany. She had been suspended, but the weight of the situation hadn't quite sunk in until she was sitting alone in her apartment, replaying the events over and over in her mind. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of guilt, anxiety, and regret. Every word Kayla had spoken to her echoed in her ears, and the memory of her sharp, controlled voice left Tiffany feeling smaller than she had ever felt before. She had spent years working in the airline industry, priding herself on her ability to deal with passengers and handle all sorts of situations. Yet, she had let her assumptions, her own biases, get in the way of her better judgment. Now, she was suspended indefinitely, awaiting an investigation that could very well end her career. She kept thinking about her future, her job, her colleagues, and the embarrassment she had brought upon herself. She had been so sure that the quiet woman sitting by the window was nothing more than a regular, unimportant passenger. But Kayla had proven her wrong in the most humiliating way. Tiffany had misjudged not only her passenger but her entire life. And now she was paying the price. Her phone buzzed again, and Tiffany, with trembling hands, unlocked it. It was a message from her supervisor. "Tiffany, I need you to come into the office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Richard Mitchell wants to have a word with you." The name Richard Mitchell struck Tiffany like a cold slap. The very idea that the owner of the airline, the man who ran the entire operation, wanted to speak with her was terrifying. She had heard the stories. Richard Mitchell was known for his no-nonsense attitude and his unwavering commitment to the airline's reputation. If he was involved, things were more serious than she had thought. Tiffany's stomach churned. What was she supposed to say to him? How could she explain what had happened without making herself look even worse? She spent the rest of the evening racked with fear. She could hardly eat, and sleep came in fits and starts, her mind racing with every possible outcome. What would Richard say? What would he do? Tiffany knew she had made a mistake, but she hadn't expected the consequences to be this severe. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her actions were not just about her. They had affected Kayla, someone who could easily turn her life upside down, someone who didn't need to lift a finger to see Tiffany's world unravel. The next morning, Tiffany arrived at the airline's headquarters, her palms sweaty as she walked through the lobby. She had been here countless times before, but today felt different. Her usually confident steps felt like they were dragging her toward a fate she wasn't sure she could face. She was led through the sterile, corporate hallways to the executive floor, where she was asked to wait outside Richard Mitchell's office. The tension in the air was thick, and Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. She was ushered into Richard's office, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city below. Richard Mitchell stood behind his desk, his imposing presence filling the room. He was a man used to being in control, and everything about him exuded power. But as Tiffany entered, she was taken aback by the calmness in his eyes. He wasn't angry, at least not outwardly, but there was an undeniable weight to his gaze. "Please, take a seat," Richard said, his voice as authoritative as ever but tinged with a quiet professional calm. Tiffany sat down in front of his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could barely meet his eyes, but she knew she had no choice but to face the music. "I've been informed about the situation with Kayla," Richard began, his voice steady. "I've also seen the complaint she filed regarding your behavior. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you, Tiffany. What you did was unacceptable, and it cannot be ignored." Tiffany nodded, her throat dry. "I know. I'm really sorry, Mr. Mitchell. I shouldn't have treated her the way I did. I've been thinking about it nonstop, and I regret it deeply. I misjudged her, and I've learned my lesson." Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. The silence between them felt unbearable. Tiffany could feel her heart racing as she waited for him to speak, each passing second adding more pressure to the room. "I don't want to hear just an apology, Tiffany," Richard finally said, his voice soft but firm. "I want you to understand the gravity of what you did. Kayla is not just a passenger. She's my wife. And when you treated her the way you did, you didn't just insult her. You insulted everything this company stands for." Tiffany felt the air leave her lungs. She hadn't known. She hadn't realized who Kayla really was. The truth crashed over her like a tidal wave, and the realization hit her harder than anything else. She had mocked and belittled the one person she should have shown the utmost respect to, all because of her own assumptions. "I didn't know," Tiffany whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who she was. I thought she was just another passenger. Please, I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't mean to," Richard interrupted. "But that doesn't change what happened. You assume someone's worth based on how they looked. And that kind of thinking has no place in this company. We pride ourselves on treating everyone with respect. That's the standard here. And when you ignore that standard, you undermine everything we've worked for." Tiffany's eyes welled with tears. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, let alone someone like Kayla. She thought about her own career, her own image, but she also thought about Kayla's perspective. She had been wrong, and now she had to face the consequences. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes not unkind but direct. "I'm not firing you today, Tiffany, but I need you to understand this. This is a wake-up call. I'm putting you on a leave of absence for the next 2 weeks. During that time, I want you to go through a series of sensitivity training courses. I want you to reflect on your actions and what they say about you, both as a person and as a representative of this airline." Tiffany nodded silently, her eyes downcast. She didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected mercy, but the chance to make things right, if she took it seriously, was something she hadn't anticipated. The leave was a second chance, a moment to prove that she could change, that she could learn from this experience. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mr. Mitchell," Tiffany said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I understand what I did was wrong, and I'll take responsibility. I'll do the training, I'll reflect. I'll do whatever is necessary to make it right." Richard studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good. I want to see real change, Tiffany. If you want to keep your job, you'll need to prove it. But remember, this company doesn't just represent the work we do. It represents the people who fly with us, people like Kayla, who expect to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are. You need to understand that, and you need to act on it." As Tiffany left Richard's office, she felt a mixture of relief and shame. She hadn't been fired, but the weight of the situation hung heavily on her shoulders. She knew that her actions had consequences, not just for her, but for the company and the people it served. Tiffany had learned a hard lesson, and though she still wasn't sure how to make things right, she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't enough to just say sorry. She had to show that she had changed, that she was truly committed to doing better. And somewhere, deep inside, she realized that this was the beginning of her own transformation. It wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about becoming the kind of person who truly understood the value of respect, and who would never again let her assumptions dictate how she treated another human being. The road to redemption. Tiffany had never felt so small. As she walked out of Richard Mitchell's office, the words he had spoken echoed in her mind, reverberating in a way that made her feel as though every step she took was weighed down by the burden of her mistake. The office door closed behind her, leaving her alone in the sterile hallway, her head swirling with thoughts of what she had done and how she could possibly make it right. She had been given a second chance, something she hadn't expected and certainly didn't deserve, but she knew she couldn't waste it. This wasn't just about saving her job. It was about changing herself, changing her mindset, her attitude, her beliefs. She had assumed that her judgment was always correct, that she knew who deserved respect and who didn't, but she had been wrong. The lesson was clear. The way she treated people was not based on their outward appearance, their status, or their presumed worth. It was based on something much more important, their humanity. Tiffany spent the next few days in a haze of conflicting emotions. She couldn't stop thinking about the encounter with Kayla, the shock that had hit her when she learned who she really was. More than anything, it stung to realize how easily she had belittled someone who deserved so much more. She couldn't stop picturing Kayla's calm, steady expression, how the woman had stood there, unapologetic in her dignity, while Tiffany had crumbled under the weight of her own ignorance. It was a painful reflection, but one Tiffany knew she had to face. There was no running from it, no pretending that it hadn't happened. It was time to take responsibility, to learn from her actions, and prove that she was more than the person she had shown herself to be on that flight. She wasn't a perfect person. No one was. But she could be better. And that was what mattered now. The first step in her road to redemption came in the form of a training course. Tiffany was required to attend sensitivity training, a course designed to educate employees about the importance of respect, inclusivity, and empathy in the workplace. At first, she was apprehensive. She had heard the stories about these training sessions, how they could feel like an endless barrage of lectures and uncomfortable discussions. But she knew it was something she had to take seriously if she was going to prove herself capable of change. The first session was eye-opening. The instructor was a woman named Helen, who had spent years working with various corporations to teach empathy and emotional intelligence. Helen's voice was calm but commanding, and she didn't waste any time diving into the heavy topics. Tiffany sat in the front row, her eyes focused on the instructor as she outlined the importance of recognizing and confronting unconscious biases. Helen spoke about the way society often categorized people based on appearance, race, class, gender, and how those assumptions shaped the way individuals were treated. Tiffany couldn't help but think back to the way she had treated Kayla. Her assumptions about the woman had been based solely on her outward appearance. Tiffany hadn't even considered the possibility that Kayla could be someone important, someone worthy of respect. And now she was paying the price for that failure to see beyond the surface. Over the next few days, the training sessions delved deeper into the concepts of respect and inclusivity. Tiffany learned about microaggressions, small, seemingly insignificant actions or comments that could hurt someone's dignity. She began to realize how many times in her life she had made those same kinds of microaggressions, thinking they were harmless. She had judged people based on their accents, their clothes, their mannerisms. She had assumed that someone who didn't fit in with her idea of success was somehow less worthy of respect. The more she learned, the more ashamed she felt of her past behavior. But at the same time, she felt a flicker of hope. She could change. She could become the kind of person who saw others not as stereotypes, but as individuals with stories and worth. One afternoon, as Tiffany sat in the final session of the course, she received a text from her supervisor. "You've been cleared to return to work, Tiffany. We'll have a meeting to discuss your next steps. I'm confident you'll handle this the right way." The message was a small relief, but it also brought a new wave of anxiety. Tiffany knew that returning to work wasn't going to be easy. She couldn't just forget the past few weeks, and neither could her colleagues. Word had spread about her suspension, and she knew that when she returned to the airline, people would be watching her. They would be waiting to see if she had truly learned her lesson, or if she was just going through the motions. The next morning, Tiffany arrived at the airport early, a knot in her stomach, as she stepped into the crew lounge. The place was filled with the usual hustle and bustle of flight attendants getting ready for their shifts, but today it felt different. The murmurs died down as she entered, and she could feel the weight of the eyes on her. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked to her locker with determination. She wasn't the same person who had walked out of this lounge 2 weeks ago. Her first flight back was a short one, a routine route that she had flown dozens of times before. But this time, it felt different. As she moved through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks, she made a conscious effort to treat every passenger with kindness and respect. She smiled at each person, no matter how grumpy or demanding they seemed. She greeted them with warmth, ensuring they knew they mattered, that they were seen. As the flight went on, Tiffany found herself thinking back to the lessons she had learned. The training had been challenging, but it had been exactly what she needed. She could already feel a shift in herself, a shift from the judgmental, dismissive person she had been to someone who was genuinely trying to make a positive impact. It wasn't about grand gestures or public apologies. It was about the small moments of kindness that built up over time. It was about the way she interacted with people, how she made them feel seen and heard. That, more than anything, was what she wanted to change. When the plane landed, Tiffany was exhausted but proud. She had managed to navigate her first flight back without making any of the same mistakes she had made in the past. She had been present, mindful, and respectful in every interaction. And even though she knew it wasn't enough to undo everything she had done, it was a start. It was a beginning. The next few weeks passed, and Tiffany worked hard to prove that she was a changed person. She continued attending additional workshops on emotional intelligence and unconscious bias, diving deeper into the things she had once overlooked. She made a point to go out of her way to connect with passengers, especially those who seemed overlooked or dismissed. She made eye contact with everyone, spoke with kindness, and never assumed anything about anyone based on how they looked. But it wasn't just about work. Tiffany began to reflect on her own personal life, on the relationships she had formed outside the airport. She had always prided herself on being pragmatic, keeping people at a distance, but now she saw how those walls had prevented her from forming deeper connections. She realized that her biases and assumptions had not only affected her work, but had influenced her personal interactions as well. It was time to break down those walls, to be vulnerable, to allow herself to connect with people on a human level. One evening, as Tiffany was finishing up her shift, she received a text from a colleague. It was simple but meaningful. "I've noticed a change in you, Tiffany. You seem different lately. I just wanted to say I appreciate it." The words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't an apology or even a grand gesture. It was just a quiet acknowledgement of the change that had been happening in her. And for Tiffany, that was enough. She didn't need anyone to forgive her overnight. She didn't need her past mistakes to be erased. She just needed to keep moving forward, to keep proving that she was capable of growth and change. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start making things right. The moment of reckoning. Tiffany's life had slowly started to settle into a new rhythm, one that was more conscious, more deliberate. The 2 weeks of sensitivity training, the self-reflection, and the weeks that followed had transformed her from the flight attendant who had dismissed a passenger based on superficial judgment to a more thoughtful, aware person. She still had a long way to go, but the changes were undeniable. Tiffany no longer let her assumptions cloud her judgment, and she worked every day to build a reputation based on respect, kindness, and genuine empathy. Her return to work had been a quiet one, marked by a steady, unspoken shift in the way she interacted with passengers. She noticed the difference in how people responded to her now that she took the time to really look at them. To see them as people, not as categories, not as labels. The rude, entitled passengers no longer bothered her. She had learned to deal with them with a patience she never thought she had, but it was the interactions with ordinary people, the quiet moments, that she treasured most. One afternoon, Tiffany found herself back on the same route she had flown just weeks earlier, the one that had marked the beginning of her suspension. She had been nervous about getting back on the plane at first, afraid the memory of that day would come rushing back and undo all the progress she had made. But as she walked through the cabin that day, she realized that the flight wasn't just a test of her skills. It was a test of her growth. This time, as she greeted the passengers, she did so with a calm assurance that felt new, but also real. However, despite her efforts to move forward, there were still those moments that lingered in the back of her mind, moments when she questioned whether her transformation was truly enough. One such moment came when she was assigned to serve a VIP flight, one she knew would be a bit more high profile. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the passenger list. Kayla Mitchell. The name was familiar, of course. Kayla was married to Richard Mitchell, the owner of the airline, and after the incident, Tiffany had seen her in news articles and on social media. Tiffany hadn't spoken to Kayla since that fateful flight, and she hadn't seen her in person, but the thought of serving her on this flight triggered a wave of nerves. Kayla was no longer just the quiet woman she had assumed to be just another passenger. She was now a symbol of the mistake Tiffany had made, the person who had brought her to the edge of her own reckoning. Tiffany hesitated for a moment at the doorway to the cabin, looking over the seating arrangements. She knew this was more than just another flight. It was an opportunity, perhaps her last, to prove that the changes she had made weren't just for show. She couldn't allow herself to let old patterns take over. This time, she had to get it right. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a confrontation that she was not fully prepared for. As Tiffany made her way down the aisle, her breath steady but her mind racing, she saw Kayla seated by the window. The woman had a quiet presence about her that drew Tiffany's attention. Kayla wasn't dressed in flashy clothes or wearing expensive jewelry. She looked just as she had on that flight, simple, graceful, and unfazed by the surrounding world. Tiffany had once dismissed that, but now she knew better. There was power in that simplicity, a quiet strength that she had been too blind to see before. Tiffany's hand shook as she approached Kayla's seat. She greeted her with a forced but polite smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Is everything all right with your seat? Can I offer you something to drink?" Kayla's gaze shifted up to meet Tiffany's, and for a brief moment, Tiffany could have sworn she saw a flicker of recognition, but Kayla's expression was calm, composed as always. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice soft but firm. Tiffany nodded quickly, trying to push past the awkwardness. She could feel the weight of the past hanging in the air between them, but Kayla's demeanor remained unchanged. It was as if the incident had never happened. Perhaps Kayla had already moved on, but Tiffany knew better than to assume anything. As she went about her duties, moving down the aisle, she kept stealing glances at Kayla. There was no overt sign of hostility, no attempt at confrontation. But Tiffany couldn't help but wonder if Kayla was waiting for her to acknowledge what had happened, to show that Tiffany had truly learned from her mistake. She could feel the pressure building inside her. It wasn't until the plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin was mostly settled, that Kayla's voice broke through the silence. "Tiffany," she said, her tone cool but not unfriendly. Tiffany froze, her heart thumping in her chest. She turned to face Kayla, unsure of what to expect. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when she would have to confront the mistake she had made head-on. Kayla looked at her, her eyes steady, unflinching. "I just wanted to say something," she began. "I know we haven't spoken since our last flight. I've thought about it, about what happened between us." Tiffany felt her stomach tighten. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize again, but Kayla stopped her with a raised hand. "I'm not here to make you feel worse about what happened," Kayla continued. "What's done is done. But I want you to understand something. It wasn't just about me. It was about every person you've ever looked at and judged. That's what needs to change. Not just for me, but for everyone." Tiffany felt the weight of Kayla's words settle in her chest. She had expected an apology, or maybe some harsh words, but instead, Kayla had given her a lesson in understanding. Tiffany nodded slowly, her throat tight as she tried to find the right words. "I know," Tiffany said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about it a lot. I was wrong, and I don't expect you to forgive me just like that. But I've been working on changing, on learning what respect really means. I've been doing everything I can to be better." Kayla watched her for a moment, and then, to Tiffany's surprise, she gave a small nod. "I can see that," she said softly. "It's not about being perfect, Tiffany. It's about being willing to see people for who they really are, to treat everyone with dignity. That's what makes the difference." The tension in Tiffany's chest eased, and she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time since that fateful flight, she felt like she had taken a step forward, not just in her relationship with Kayla, but in her understanding of herself. There was no quick fix for her past mistakes, no simple solution. But this moment, this quiet acknowledgement of her growth, was enough for now. It was enough to show her that change was possible. As Tiffany finished the flight, she found herself looking at every passenger a little differently. She didn't just see them as people with needs or demands. She saw them as individuals, each with their own story, each deserving of respect. The work was far from over, but Tiffany was no longer afraid of the journey. She knew that the road to redemption wasn't a straight path. It was filled with setbacks, challenges, and difficult moments. But it was worth it. As she watched Kayla leave the plane at the end of the flight, their eyes met once more. Kayla gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, and Tiffany smiled back, feeling a sense of quiet pride. She didn't need Kayla's forgiveness to move forward. What mattered was that she had learned. What mattered was that, for the first time, she was seeing the world through different eyes. Eyes that could look past the surface and see the worth in every person, no matter who they were or where they came from. And that, Tiffany realized, was just the beginning.